Welcome back to America's Fractured Politics. The Iran conflict has been sold to the public as a story with a clear objective, a story you can sum up in a few bullet points on a briefing slide. Stop their nuclear program, punish their proxies, restore deterrence, and then, by a kind of geopolitical magic, stability returns to the Middle East. That's the version you hear from podiums and press conferences. It sounds linear. It sounds manageable. It sounds like a plan. But when you dig deeper into this narrative, you don't find a coherent plan at all. You find something far more unsettling. You find a chaotic conflict with no endgame, an open-ended confrontation that keeps multiplying fronts without ever articulating a destination. There is no real path forward resolution, just a series of improvised moves, each of which generates new risks and new victims. What we're watching isn't a strategy leading to peace. It's the management of an endless catastrophe. To understand the various possible endgames people like to talk about, you have to start with how we got here. This didn't begin with one airstrike or one assassination. For decades, Israel and Iran fought a shadow war, a slow-motion conflict just below the threshold of open war. It featured cyber attacks on Iranian nuclear facilities, mysterious explosions at military sites, assassinations of scientists in the streets, and covert operations spanning multiple countries. Iran, for its part, favored proxies and asymmetric attacks. Israel favored deniability and precision. The Gaza war after October 7 changed that balance completely. It pulled the mask off the shadow war and dragged Iran's network of allies much more fully into the open. Hezbollah in Lebanon, Shia militias in Iraq and Syria, the Houthis in Yemen, all of these actors, already part of Iran's sphere of influence, became more deeply engaged in a multi-front confrontation that radiates outward from Gaza. What had been compartmentalized and semi-covert began to blur into a broader regional war. Israeli strikes on Iranian targets became more open, less about plausible deniability, and more about public messaging. Iranian missile and drone attacks on Israeli territory became more frequent, framed by Tehran as deterrence and by Israel as aggression. U.S. forces scattered across bases in Iran and Syria and naval deployments in the Red Sea found themselves constantly playing defense, shooting down drones, intercepting missiles, trying to keep shipping lanes open, while desperately trying to avoid a large-scale regional war. In the Red Sea and the Gulf of Aden, the United States found itself defending commercial shipping from Houthi attacks while also trying to deter strikes on its own forces. What used to be a long-simmering hostility between Iran and its adversaries hardened into something that looks and feels like a war with no end. It's a conflict locked in a feedback loop, provocation, and retaliation. From the U.S. perspective, the story we're fed to the public is that America wants to prevent a nuclear war with Iran, protect its forces and regional partners, and support the Iranian people against an oppressive regime. It's wrapped in the language of nonproliferation, security, and human rights. But if you strip away the branding, that package of goals is indistinguishable from regime change. You don't try to weaken a government economically, diplomatically, militarily, and politically while claiming to speak for its people, unless you're angling for its transformation or collapse. The endgame the U.S. projects is confusing in the extreme. It oscillates between containment and regime change, between we just want to constrain their program and we stand with the Iranian people against their oppressors. Sanctions are meant to squeeze the regime's finances and, in theory, fuel internal discontent that might one day force change. But in practice, those sanctions are not working in the way their architects promised. The regime has found ways to adapt, to smuggle, to cooperate with other sanctioned states. The economic pain lands hardest on ordinary Iranians, while the security state consolidates, and while all of this is happening, Washington has effectively allowed Russia to deepen its partnership with Iran, militarily, technologically, and economically. Moscow gets drones and missiles for its own wars, Iran gets an outlet beyond Western sanctions and access to Russian military and intelligence support. That relationship raises a host of disturbing questions about what U.S. policy really thinks it's accomplishing. Those questions are big enough to be the subject of their own episode. At the same time, we see episodic efforts at diplomacy, quiet talks in neutral capitals, maybe some back-channel messages that are supposed to promote partial nuclear constraints or de-escalation. These are framed as ways to buy time, to reduce tensions, to manage risk. But the underlying delusion remains constant. The idea that Iran will, under pressure, morph into a weaker, more pragmatic state that still exists and functions, but voluntarily abandons its regional ambitions and accepts an American-designed security architecture in which it plays the role of a tamed adversary. That pie-in-the-sky idea raises more serious questions than it answers. What if the pressure doesn't moderate the regime, but hardens it? What if the combination of sanctions, military strikes, and domestic repression doesn't break Iran's leadership, but instead produces a more paranoid, more nationalist, more risk-acceptant elite, convinced that compromise equals suicide? What if the Iranian people the U.S. claims to support are the ones who are devastated by economic sanctions and collapse and falling bombs and missiles, bearing the brunt of a confrontation they never chose? At some point, they will reach the only logical conclusion, that the great powers are not liberating them. They are using them as leverage, as an instrument in someone else's game. The Trump regime wants to have it every way at once. It pursues a de facto regime-changing policy while denying that's what it's doing. It brands any serious diplomacy as appeasement or betrayal. And it convinces itself that history will somehow deliver a friendly, stable, post-Islamic Republic state, without ever describing how that transition is supposed to work, who is supposed to carry it out, or who is accountable when it goes wrong. It is fantasy as grand strategy. Israel's endgame is even more brutal and unhinged. For years, Israeli leaders have argued that Iran's nuclear program is not just a serious problem, but an existential threat. Once you accept that paradigm, you've created a zero-sum game. Either Iran is permanently denied a nuclear capability, or Israel lives under the specter of annihilation. There is no gray zone in that story, no room for mutual deterrence or imperfect stability. That narrative has justified aggressive campaigns, the assassinations of Iranian nuclear scientists on city streets, cyber attacks like Stuxnet, and periodic strikes on Iranian assets in Syria and elsewhere. But the combination of the Gaza war and direct Iranian missile and drone attacks crossed a psychological threshold. This is not the old deniable shadow warfare. It is a brutal, overt confrontation that changed the calculus in Jerusalem. A government led by hardline survivalist politicians looked at a fraying regional order, questioned the reliability of U.S. politics, and concluded that this was the moment to seize the initiative. Not simply to delay Iran's nuclear program, but to try to break the regime itself into pieces. That strategy, in plain language, is regime change. It means repeated strikes on Iranian infrastructure, not just nuclear facilities, but missile launcher sites, command and control networks, Revolutionary Guard assets, and other primary symbols of state power. It means frenzied lobbying and campaign contributions in Washington to push for ever tighter sanctions, more confrontational policies, and diplomatic isolation for Tehran. It means framing any U.S.-Iran talks as a threat, not a potential stabilizing opportunity, because any deal that leaves Iran with any enrichment capacity whatsoever is portrayed as a betrayal of Israel's security. In the maximalist Israeli position, all of this pressure and destruction leads, eventually, to internal rupture in Iran. The regime collapses, the Revolutionary Guard ceases to exist, or is at least fatally weakened. A more pliant government emerges, one that accepts strict nuclear limits, ends its sponsorship of Hezbollah and other proxies, and stops threatening Israel directly or indirectly. What's striking is that the same Israeli and American commentators who talk so casually about destabilizing the Iranian regime, almost never dwell on the scale of the state they're proposing to destabilize. Iran is not Iraq or Syria. It is a large, multi-ethnic, heavily populated state with entrenched security institutions, strong regional identities, and a political system that, for all its authoritarianism, contains real factions, real elections of a constrained sort, and real patronage networks that the millions of lives into its structures. What is regime collapse supposed to look like in that environment? It doesn't look like a clean revolution with a tidy new government. It looks like a civil war that spreads across ethnic, ideological, and regional lines. It looks like a prolonged fragmentation in a territory that sits on major energy reserves and controls or influences key maritime routes for global trade. And here's the thing. The people who cheer this on from afar really volunteer to host the refugees, to rebuild the society, or to own the consequences. They're happy to talk about freedom and democracy for Iranians. They're far less eager to deal with the actual aftermath. Iran, for its part, has never pretended that it's playing for some abstract notion of regional peace. The Islamic Republic's overriding objective is survival of the regime. That's it. Everything else is either a tool or a byproduct. It wants enough deterrent capability, conventional and possibly nuclear, to make any direct invasion or full-scale attack suicidal. It promotes a network of partners and proxies that function as both sword and shield, a means of projecting power and an avenue to retaliate at arm's length. Hezbollah in Lebanon is a major deterrent against Israel, a constant reminder that any attack on Iran can be answered on Israel's northern border. Shia militias in Iraq and a smaller presence in Syria are cudgels against U.S. forces and influence, a way of making occupation or long-term basing painful. The Houthis in Yemen, with their growing ability to strike shipping in the Red Sea and Gulf of Aden, give Iran lever on global trade routes. They can raise the cost of confrontation not just for regional adversaries, but for the global economy. The Iranian leadership does not need each of these groups to win in a conventional sense. It doesn't need Hezbollah to march on Tel Aviv or the Houthis to control the seas. It needs them to make life dangerous for anybody who wants to bring war to Iran itself. Their role is to complicate the calculations of would-be attackers, to inject risk and uncertainty into any attempt at regime change or major escalation. Iran's endgame, then, is less complicated than Washington's or Israel's. It wants to survive. It will tolerate strikes, repair what can be repaired, deepen security ties with Russia and China, and keep the nuclear program in a gray zone, somewhere between overt weaponization and latent capability, while it waits for political shifts in Washington and Jerusalem. It is a strategy of patience of outlasting opponents by betting on their fatigue, their political turnover, and their internal contradictions. But that patience is not free. It is paid for with the lives and futures of many others. Every time the Houthis launch missiles or drones at commercial ships in the Red Sea, they are acting on Iran's behalf, and crews from all over the world are suddenly in the line of fire. Every time Hezbollah fires on Israel across the Lebanese border, communities on both sides are displaced and traumatized. Every time the militias harass U.S. bases in Iraq or Syria, they are compelling Lebanese, Iraqi, and Syrian civilians to live with the consequences of a confrontation they do not control, all while Iran maintains plausible deniability. Iran's leaders are playing for survival, but not for regional peace. Their bet is simple, that the U.S. and Israel will tire of the sacrifice and the political cost inherent in this conflict before Iran's own leadership is forced to fundamentally change. Once you strip away the rhetoric, you can classify the future into 4 possible endgames. And the uncomfortable reality is that none of them are truly palatable. The first endgame is what we might call containment. In this environment, there is no decisive victory for anybody. The Islamic Republic survives in some recognizable form. Israel and the United States keep striking when they feel compelled to restore deterrence. Iran and its proxies retaliate when they believe it is necessary to maintain credibility and fear. The nuclear program is kept below a certain threshold that outside powers can grudgingly tolerate, but the core issue is never fully resolved. Shipping in the Red Sea and the Persian Gulf is periodically disrupted, which drives up global insurance rates, oil prices, and gasoline costs. But the arteries of trade are never fully severed. It becomes a simmering but normalized state of emergency. The upside, and that's a very relative term, is that it avoids the all-out collapse of Iran and the dangerous unknown that follows. The downside is that it locks in a simmering war with constant fears of miscalculation, repeated disruptions to commerce, and a permanent security state in every country involved. Civilians across the region live indefinitely in a state of risk and intermittent tragedy that never really disappears. It just ebbs and flows. The second endgame is regime change and fragmentation. This is what we get if the maximalist Israeli position prevails and American dithering hardens into open support. In this scenario, the war effort is explicitly structured to push the Iranian regime over the edge through systematic destruction of critical infrastructure, intensifying sanctions, covert operations aimed at promoting internal dissent and insurgency, and diplomatic moves designed to isolate Tehran from any potential partners. The fantasy version of this ending, attractive to war hawks in Tel Aviv and Washington, is that the old regime simply crumbles. Reformists and exiles step into the vacuum. The security apparatus is somehow crushed or converted. Iran, chastened by its lost decades, joins the ranks of civilized nations and aligns itself with Western interests. The more plausible ending, if you take even a cursory look at the last 2 decades of regime change experiments, is far uglier. It is a violent, prolonged transition in which armed factions proliferate, external powers back their chosen proxies, and Iran becomes a permanent battlefield. It is the Syria-Iraq-Libya strategy rebooted on a much larger, more dangerous scale. It does not deliver a clean break with the past. It enshrines chaos as the new normal. The third endgame is nuclear deterrence. This is the path where Iran, despite sabotage, assassination, airstrikes, and sanctions, manages to build a nuclear weapon, or at least reach a position where it can assemble one very quickly, if threatened. It might not parade a bomb in public, but the capability is there, understood by all the serious players. The political consequence would be seismic. Once Iran becomes nuclear armed or very close to it, regime change goes from risky to almost unthinkable. The logic shifts from how do we stop Iran from getting a bomb to how do we avoid triggering a nuclear exchange. That change doesn't make the conflict go away. It just freezes it into a far more precarious form. A nuclear Iran would almost certainly provoke reactions from Saudi Arabia and other regional states. The idea that Israel can maintain a nuclear monopoly in a region this fractured, this riven with conflict, is not realistic. You cannot expect only one country to wield that level of destructive power in a neighborhood defined by rivalry and distrust. Over time, the region edges toward a multipolar nuclear standoff, with all the dangers of miscalculation, accidental escalation, and brinksmanship that implies. The fourth endgame, the one that looks most like peace on paper and most like fantasy in current politics, is a regional security program. This would require the U.S., Israel, and Iran to drop the propaganda and accept a set of circumstances they have each spent years calling unacceptable. For Washington, it would mean conceding that it cannot bomb or sanction its way to a stable order, and that credible security guarantees and real sanctions relief are part of any lasting arrangement. For Israel, it would mean accepting that Iran will retain some level of nuclear technology and regional influence, and that permanent war is a greater existential threat than a constrained, monitored enemy. For Iran, it would mean agreeing to place real enforceable limits on its nuclear program, its missile arsenal, and its use of proxies in exchange for a path out of diplomatic and economic isolation. The obstacle here is not technical. Verification regimes exist. Confidence-building mechanisms exist. The obstacle is political will. Each leadership class has built its legitimacy on the insistence that the other side only understands the language of power and force. In that worldview, diplomacy isn't strategy, it's capitulation. Compromise is betrayal. So each of these endgames, when you pull them apart, fails to provide actual peace, safety, and security to the region's suffering populations. Containment preserves the conflict at a low boil. Regime change risks tearing a major state apart. Nuclear deterrence entrenches fear instead of resolving grievances. A regional security framework remains the distant mirage everyone claims is impossible. The dark truth is that none of the major players has a credible exit ramp because none of them is structurally geared toward finding one. In Washington, toughness toward Iran is one of the few bipartisan positions left, a default posture that shields politicians from accusations of weakness. In Israel, Netanyahu faces corruption charges and deep domestic opposition. He has every incentive to shift politics onto questions of survival in war, where compromise equals treason and accountability can be indefinitely postponed. In Iran, hardliners who turned resistance into their brand identity can't easily pivot to compromise without threatening the narrative that justifies their grip on power. And so the conflict continues. Each strike is labeled a necessary response. Each proxy attack is framed as justified retaliation. Each new round of sanctions becomes not an admission of failure, but another symbol of moral resolve. The system feeds on itself. As a consequence, when we talk about endgames for the Iran conflict, we are not really talking about endings at all. We're talking about different forms of permanent instability, different ways of managing a crisis that our leaders have no intention of truly solving. The tidy endings, the pragmatic new Iran, the triumphant regime change, the obedient post-war order are fictions. They are deployed to justify present policies, not to describe realistic pathways grounded in the last 20 years of war and intervention. Indeed, the real choice in front of us is more sobering. Do we ultimately admit that the only tolerable endgame is one in which everyone gets less than they want, one in which states swallow their pride and settle for incomplete victories so that millions of people can live without being hostages to someone else's geopolitical script? Or do we wage yet another forever war, another open-ended campaign of pressure, bombing, and covert action, and proxy violence for the sake of maintaining hardened, failed positions that have already proven their inability to deliver peace? It would be comforting to say that this war, and the regional crisis wrapped around it, will bring about a sudden spasm of sense, a moment when the cost in blood and treasure becomes so obvious that leaders are forced to change course. But nothing in the behavior of the major players suggests that's where we're headed. None of them is interested in finding a way out that would require genuine sacrifice of doctrine, pride, or myth. And so millions are killed, maimed, and displaced, and the latest iteration of the forever Middle East war continues unabated. The names of the operations change, the talking points are updated, the cast of politicians rotates, but the basic structure, the refusal to imagine an end that doesn't look like total victory, stays the same. That's the reality behind the rhetoric of endgames. Not an ending, but a set of choices about what kind of instability we're willing to normalize and how many lives we're willing to grind through the machine to preserve the illusion that someone, somewhere, still knows what they're doing. This has been America's Fractured Politics.